Well, welcome once again to ARTbreak, everyone. We kind of begin a new season, and I can say there should be some really interesting programs that will be coming up as well. Well, today we'll be looking at Chinese ceramics, and the history of ceramic making in China goes back some 10,000 years. And during that time, China was really the source of most of the advancements in world ceramics. That changed in the 19th century when other Asian countries and European countries began to develop their own ceramic traditions. And China was sort of left somewhat behind in terms of its influence. However, this has changed in the last 20 years when there's been a really revival of ceramics in contemporary China. And their artists, they're both breaking new ground and at the same time connecting to the traditional values and sources of Chinese culture. And one of them, excuse me, Hong Wei, is the subject of the exhibit down in the lower gallery, and hopefully you'll all have a chance to take a look at it. And I will also mention there is a catalog that goes with it that's on the desk by the contribution box that includes an essay by our guest today. And our guest today, is Andrew Maske, and he is the director of Wayne State's Gordon Groscott Museum. And previous to that, he has taught both at the Rhode Island School of Design and at the University of Kentucky. He was also the curator of Japanese art at the Peabody Essex Museum in Massachusetts, which holds one of the major collections of Asian art in this country. He also has written a book called Potters and Patrons in Edo, Japan, that is really viewed as the definitive study in this particular field. But as I mentioned, today our focus is on contemporary Chinese art, so please welcome Andrew Maske.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming today. For those of you who are watching remotely, for logging on. I will be talking about the work of Hong Wei and trying to set it in the broader context of both Chinese ceramics, world ceramics, and particularly contemporary ceramics, and explore how his art has reached the point that it is at now. So Hong Wei was born in 1980, right around the time that China was opening up to the outside world after Nixon's famous visit to China in 1974. As a result, he benefited from the interaction that, although first limited, was at least allowed in the 1980s and later in China. He was educated at the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing, which is clearly and widely accepted as China's top art school. And after receiving his degree in sculpture, went on to earn an MFA at the New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred University in Alfred, New York. And interestingly, that college and the Jingdezhen Ceramics Institute in Jingdezhen, China, China's porcelain capital, are among the only institutions of higher education that are focused um, uh, primarily or even solely on ceramic production. Today, Li Hongwei works both in China with his studio in Beijing and in the United States in the town of Alfred, and he's a visiting scholar, sort of a continuing visiting scholar at Alfred University. So this shows you a little bit that where he is from. You can see Tangshan up at the top. That is his hometown. I was in China in 2006, 2007 to explore contemporary ceramics production in China. Not production of general ceramics, but specifically of studio ceramics and art ceramics. And I was pointed to Tangshan as a place to go to find out about art ceramics. However, and that was quite early in 2000, my visit in 2006. And I was surprised to find that the Chinese considered art ceramics to be anything that you used to decorate your house with. And most of the pieces there were production pieces, although some of them were very large, vases taller than I am, and that sort of thing, which one could find and still can find in, for example, hotels in China today. Well, what I was looking for was handmade, creative ceramics, one-of-a-kind pieces made in innovative ways, not decorative pieces like were made in Tangshan. So after my visit to Tangshan, I learned to ask for makers of creative ceramics, not art ceramics, which had a very different definition to Chinese people. So Tangshan is located very close to Beijing, China's capital. You can see there. And notice where the name for the country China is located. We'll see that on the next map in just a moment. Well, this is the installation of Li Hongwei's work in the University of Kentucky Art Museum, where I designed the installation and wrote the catalog, selected the pieces earlier this year. So you have, or soon will see, I'm sure, the installation downstairs. And you can tell that, it's different than anything you have ever seen before. And I can say that pretty confidently. Li Hongwei is extremely original, extremely visionary, and has tremendous technical as well as aesthetic, technical abilities as well as aesthetic sensitivities. In contrast to Li Hongwei's work in 2006, 2007, when I was in China, I found much more sedate, standard installations of contemporary ceramics. Now, I was in China on a Fulbright fellowship, specifically for the purpose of exploring contemporary ceramic art in China. As a specialist originally and researcher of Japanese ceramics, I knew that in the 1950s, even as early as the late 1940s, after Japan's defeat in World War II, Japanese ceramicists had begun avidly exploring new routes to expression in the ceramic medium, and had developed wonderful new works that were unlike anything that had been created before, that were linking into the abstract expressionist painting and other related art forms in the United States and in Europe. And so potters in Japan like Yagi Kazuo were making abstract objects out of ceramic, breaking away from the vessel as a format for ceramics. His contemporaries, such as Yamada Hikaru, were doing the same thing, and really finding ways to bring Japanese ceramics to the forefront of the creative ceramics world globally, and attracting a great deal of attention. This has continued down to the present day with artists like Akiyama Yo, who was a pupil of Yagi Kazuo, who I showed you first. So all of this had been going on in Japan. Yet China, it's China, not Japan, that has the world's greatest ceramic tradition. In addition, as I'm sure you all know, China has the world's largest population. So it seemed to be sort of low-hanging fruit as far as a research topic for me to go to China and find contemporary ceramic artists. And that's why I applied to do that in my Fulbright. When I arrived in China, however, I found that Chinese ceramic artists had remained quite conservative and had not been able to find ways to really break out of their traditional modes in a way that was truly innovative and surprising to artists who work globally. So here you can see a piece from 2019. It's still really continuing today. This is in the was on display in the Beijing Metropolitan Museum, showing the top ceramic artists in China. But in fact, the climate for artists and exhibitions in China has remained really quite conservative. And I have to admit that after spending a year in China in 2006, 2007, I came away with a few artists that were rather interesting, but really no one or nothing that was that really, I thought, would shake things up on a global scale. At that time, Hong Wei, you may be asking, well, what about Hong Wei? Hong Wei was still an MFA student at Alfred University. But I want to show you how his art developed so you can see what it takes. Just being Chinese and being one of more than 1 billion people doesn't mean that you can become a great ceramic artist. It takes more than that. And I think that we will see more emerging outstanding Chinese artists as time passes. Well, there is Tangshan, and I told you to watch China right there in the middle. Oops, a little out of order here. But I'll show you first that the key to Hong Wei's development as an artist was his decision to go to Alfred University here in the US. And it was that further stimulation on top of the training that he received, which was excellent training at the Central Academy of the Arts in Beijing, and his background as a Chinese national going through the Chinese education system enabled him to make that leap to really a world-class artist. And these are the sort of things, this year at Alfred, the sort of things that he was exposed to that got him thinking in ways that he was unable to, or that he was not exposed to when he was living in China and studying there. So there, finally, the map. If you look right in the middle of the yellow area, this is China in 1600. What we saw before was China today. You see a name, Chang'an. Does anyone know what Chang'an is? You won't find it on a contemporary map of China. Has anyone been to China? Yeah, okay. Have any of you visited Xi'an? Xian, right? Yeah, all of you, yeah. So Xi'an is China's ancient capital, but Xi'an is its modern name. In the past, it was known as Chang'an. So Chang'an is the same as Xi'an, and you can see that it's located right in the middle of China's heartland. So Beijing, or as we sort of mispronounce it, Peking, actually P-E-K-I-N-G is supposed to be pronounced Beijing, just the same way as it is today. It's just, we read it incorrectly. But Beijing was there in 1600, but in ancient history in China, Beijing didn't exist. It was nowhere until about 1300, when the Mongols moved their capital there, or established their capital there. So Chang'an was is the great ancient capital of China. I want to go there. When you went to Xi'an, no doubt you went out to see the Terracotta Army, the Terracotta Warriors, and that is by no means the earliest of Chinese ceramics, but it's perhaps the earliest famous Chinese ceramics. And you saw this scene there in the Great Pit number 3 with the Terracotta Warriors located there. So I show you this to remind you not only that Chinese ceramics are very ancient, but also that many of them, many of the early works were sculptural in nature. And it's important to remember that, and to remember that Li Hongwei was trained not as a ceramicist, but as a sculptor. The Terracotta Army has been invoked in modern ceramic art by this woman artist from Norway, Marian Heyerdahl. And this was an installation that I saw in Beijing in 2007 when I was there doing research. So, in fact, there were non-Chinese artists whose work was actually, I'm sorry to say, more interesting than some of the Chinese ceramists at that time. Jump forward to the Tang Dynasty, and another famous dynasty of Chinese art, and also the interaction with other cultures during the Tang Dynasty. And that's sort of illustrated by these foreign musicians on the back of a camel. Of course, neither the musicians nor the camel were native to China, but this tomb sculpture was found in a Chinese tomb, and it illustrates those international connections that were going on. So even in the past, Chinese ceramicists have found their inspiration beyond China's borders. So it's not something that's unique to contemporary China, or to Li Hongwei for that matter. And there you can see those trade routes. You know, we hear of the Silk Road and we think of like one road that goes across from China to Rome or something like that. Sorry about that. But actually there were many different routes, and some of them even went down the coast of Africa and around throughout Southeast Asia. And even though it's not shown on here, they went to the right, far right, to Japan, to Korea. So there were connections with with China and Chinese ceramics in particular throughout the world. Chinese ceramics have been found in Mexico, for example, in South America, though not from the period of the Tang Dynasty. So the Song Dynasty is where we start to see the actual literal first inspirations of Li Hongwei's work. And the Song Dynasty is known as the classical period of Chinese ceramics, divided into the Northern Song and the Southern Song based on simply the location of the capital in Northern China or in Southern China, where it moved later. So beautiful works like of the 5 classical wares of Chinese ceramics, such as guanware. You've seen this beautiful bottle vase here from the Northern Song Dynasty, and also ruware in this this warming bowl that would have had a vessel holding wine that was placed in it. Ruware is particularly rare. There are less than 100 pieces known worldwide. That includes museums, private collections, anything. And so these are very, very highly prized, and it's not surprising that Li Hongwei took some of his early, relatively early inspiration from them. Here's an example of a very famous tea bowl. These are even more rare. There are only 4 known to exist in the world. 3 of them have been handed down by tea ceremony connoisseurs in Japan, including this one. But I show it to you because this has an iridescent crystalline glaze, and it is crystalline glazes that Li Hongwei hit upon to cover many of his contemporary ceramic and sculptural works. So he's hooking into Song Dynasty forms. He's also hooking into a tradition of crystalline glazes. Although crystalline glazes were not very highly developed in China and were not very widely used because they're quite volatile, which is an aspect that also is important to Li Hongwei's work, as we'll see in a moment. After the Song Dynasty fell. In fact, the reason we have a Northern Song Dynasty and a Southern Song Dynasty is because the capital of the Northern Song Dynasty was captured by an invading tribe called the Jurchens. And the emperor had to flee to the south and take over a smaller area, which is known as the Southern Song Dynasty. The Southern Song Dynasty and the Jurchen area to the north both fell in the late 13th century to the Mongols, who established their own dynasty with their capital far to the north in what is known as Beijing, which means northern capital. That actually wasn't the name when they established it, but it's the name it has today. So the Mongols conquered a huge area, they had the largest empire that the world has ever known, extending all the way to Eastern Europe from China, which is really quite amazing. And the ceramics of China then spread throughout those areas, and influences from those areas came back to China via the Mongols and their conquest. And this is an example of a pear-shaped vase with a celadon glaze. And this clearly was an inspiration for Li Hongwei, as we see in one of his works here with the crystalline glaze. So once he began to develop his crystalline glazes, Li Hongwei wanted something that would distinguish his works as being Chinese. He felt that was important. And so he used his new glaze technology or his glaze expertise, I should say, to create new versions of traditional Chinese shapes, which we can see here. He took a variety of different traditional shapes, such as blue and white. This reflects those connections that the Yuan dynasty had with countries such as Persia, where they adopted actually the use of cobalt as a decorative element on white porcelain from Islamic countries where they did not have porcelain, but they had cobalt decoration on low-fired pottery. And so when we think of China, we think of blue and white, we think of Chinese ceramics. But in fact, the use of cobalt blue on a white surface for painting really began in what we call today the Middle East and came to China via the Mongols. And the Mongols applied that painting to Chinese porcelain. And so here again, it's that same sort of pear-shaped vase with an example by Hong Wei with his beautiful crystalline glaze. Another shape that grew up during that time and in later years, actually a little bit later than this, is the onion head vase, which we see an example by Hong Wei on the right, which correlates to an overglazed enamel example in porcelain from the 17th to 18th century on the left. Another type of vase called a mallet vase. You can see here these developed later, mostly in the late 18th and 19th centuries, and Hong Wei used those shapes for his glazes. Now, if he had simply made Chinese shapes with crystalline glazes, they're very beautiful. The glazes are lovely. But his work really would not capture the imagination of ceramic specialists, ceramic innovators, and that sort of thing. He's really gone beyond this, as you know. But the process by which he did so is quite interesting. So, as I mentioned earlier, crystalline glazes are quite volatile, which means sometimes they don't create crystals, or the crystals they make are very small, or they're not very attractive, or their shapes are not very good, or because of the way that they develop, the glaze can slide off of the piece completely, okay? Because the crystals form in the cooling process after the glazes get to a particular temperature. Okay, so that has to be very carefully calibrated. You can do that with a gas kiln. You can do that with an electric kiln. But it's very difficult to do in a wood-firing kiln, okay, or a coal-fired kiln. And that's what was being used historically in China, okay? So I mentioned that there are a few examples of crystalline glazes in Chinese history, but not a lot of them. And that's the reason. You're trying to get this beautiful crystalline glaze, but to do so, your pieces have to be in exactly the right part of the kiln and have to cool at exactly the right rate to get those glazes to come out. And if they're in a part of the kiln that gets too hot, or it cools too slowly or too quickly, you get a plain, ugly, brown, black piece. Not ugly necessarily, but not something really special. And that's a lot of waste. And so crystalline glazes were not very widely used until we got the technology to really control those temperatures and that cooling cycle. So in the process of developing his crystalline glazes, Hong Wei discovered plenty of pieces that had crystals that were beautiful on one side, and kind of ugly on the other. So a piece that has good crystals on one side but not on the other, is that going to be a good piece to display or sell? No, it's essentially ruined. And he thought, what a waste. I wish there was something I could do to preserve this piece, because this side is so beautiful, even though the other side is not. And he started to think, is there some way that I could replace the misfired side with something else? And because he was a sculptor, not just a ceramic artist, I think, from what I know of ceramic artists, and I'm not one myself, would say, didn't come out right, throw it away, okay? But Li Hongwei, as a sculptor, said, I can do something. I have skills that I can perhaps use to preserve a piece that's misfired on one side. There are some of those crystals. Beautiful, right? If you have this come out on your vase, even if the other side is ugly, I mean, my goodness, that's wonderful. It never comes out the same. You can control it to a point. He says that he can control basically what his pieces do, what his crystalline glazes do, about 80 to 90% of the time. But even so, it's not like you're painting it. It grows. It actually grows in the cooling, like you see frost on a window. If you've looked at frost on your window, those are crystals. Those are crystals that have developed through the freezing of the water on the glass. That's the same process that takes place for crystalline glazes. It's freezing as it cools into this form. You can see that looks sort of almost like relief on the left-hand side, right? It looks sort of like raised relief. It actually is. So if you stroke, I'm not saying go down and stroke the pieces on display, but if you were to stroke them, you could feel those crystals. They're actually physically there. It's not under the glaze. It's not a motif that's been added. It's actually the glaze growing in this way, or sort of congealing in this way. There you can see some more crystals, the blue on the yellow. So why stainless steel? Okay, that's what I've been explaining. It's a way to salvage works that had been misfired. That's where he came up with the idea. Okay, I'm not saying that every piece that you see that has stainless steel was salvaged and had a part of it that had to be replaced. He's actually doing that as sculpture. Okay, so he's not just repairing damaged ceramics. That's where the idea first came from. He's making sculpture through the combination of ceramic and steel. And here you can see one of his beautiful works in that way. One of his Xuan series. And I asked him what Xuan means, and he said it's kind of an indefinite, difficult to define term. It actually means something like mystery or mysterious. Okay, so it is a mystery how this hard porcelain and steel can be in the shape of a water droplet, like a liquid. So that's what he's getting at in terms of his name of this series of Xuan. And his use of the stainless steel is done in a way that is artistic. So it's not that all of that area at the bottom and top was misfired. It's his artistry to cut it to that and match it to that shape. And you can see a wonderful video downstairs that shows you the the painstaking, time-consuming process that is required to make these works. There's part of the installation at the University of Kentucky with those various incarnations of his Xuan series. Part of that idea of using a different material to repair something that was misfired or even damaged comes from a technique that actually developed in Japan for repairing and conserving ceramics called Kinshudi, or it's better known as kintsugi. Kintsugi means actually using lacquer covered in gold leaf to put pieces of ceramic, broken ceramic, back together. Kinshudi is where, like you see here, they've used lacquer to fill in a piece that's missing and then covered it with gold leaf. So people make the mistake that thinking that it's repaired with solid gold, like all of that was gold. It's not. It's lacquer with some filler, and then gold leaf is applied to the outside. It's not solid gold. But of course, you can see a piece that was damaged. It wouldn't be usable. It would be somewhat unattractive, has now been made whole again through the use of this kinshudi. And rather than trying to hide the repair, sort of making use of the repair almost as a type of decorative motif or a part of the piece that draws attention rather than seeks to hide away. Well, as a sculptor, Li Hongway has then gone on to create larger pieces using his stainless steel and porcelain constructions, making things like his allegory of balance series, which we see an example here, going even further and exploring new ideas beyond simply porcelain and stainless steel. He's also used stainless steel in this way, and I think this may have been his first use actually of stainless steel. So when he had a side of a vessel that misfired, you can cut it in half, get rid of the part that was misfired, and then what do? You attach it to a mirror, or in this case, a polished stainless steel. And then, if you look from the side, you can see, I hope you can see, if you look from the side, the vessel appears whole again because you get the reflection of what is there on the surface. The half part gets reproduced by the mirror, and it looks like you have a whole, sort of like you have a whole vessel there. And therefore he's called this his illusion series, okay? The other thing about these works that is pretty cool is that he always has featured them upside down, okay? So it's not simply a vessel, half a vessel with a mirror, but it's actually inverted. And when you look at them, you also see yourself in the mirror. And so you become part of the scene. You're right side up, the vessel's upside down and reflected. And it starts to, there are different ways that you can interpret what's going on. And of course, it changes anywhere you move. How much of the vessel you see, how much of yourself you see, and that sort of thing. So he's doing really quite innovative things that simply making a ceramic and placing it in a case can never do. Well, jumping back quickly to the Terracotta Army, of course, the Terracotta Army were originally installed as we see them standing upright and that sort of thing. But when Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor, died, he was quite a ruthless ruler. Those of you who visited there know about that. And the people after him who overthrew his dynasty went to his burial chamber and set it on fire. And so the roof collapsed, and all of those figures were crushed and became fragmented, as you see here. So this is how they were excavated in pieces. So they have to be reconstructed. And that's an important part of Chinese ceramics history too. Throughout the world, all the places that Chinese ceramics were exported to, all those places on the map, you find Chinese ceramics, but they're under the ground. They're in fragments. They're being excavated and survive, though in pieces, to show, to demonstrate the connections with China that have existed for hundreds or even some cases thousands of years. On the bottom of oceans where there are shipwrecks, they're found as well. In China at kiln sites, if you go to a place where ceramic production took place over an extended period of time, pieces that misfired, just like Li Hongwei's pieces sometimes misfire, they were simply discarded. This is in a town called Chunlu, that in northern China, where ceramics were made starting in the 14th century, 13th century, 14th century, down into the 19th century. And the potters there threw their pieces into a stream. And this is down at the stream, at the bottom of the stream is very low. And above the stream, you have layers of ceramic shards that extend more than 20 feet high. If you look at the bottom right of this slide, you can see my hand. That shows you how big, it shows you part of how big this ceramic shard heap actually is. And there you can see that whole area is just filled with shards, more shards than dirt, actually. Well, Li Hongwei couldn't leave that type of inspiration be. He had to incorporate it into his work. And so we have his most recent series called Fragments, two wonderful shuan downstairs, including this one, on display as a way of making use of those fragments of the pieces that he fired, that were misfired, smashed. Well, our life is all about recycling these days, isn't it? I came to Michigan, found out my can could be turned in for 10 cents. Wow, we don't have that in Kentucky. So Li Hongwei is looking at how can we make use of things that had previously been discarded? And he's used his technical expertise to take shards and make a sort of patchwork, create a patchwork effect in combination with stainless steel on his pieces like this. He has, as his abilities have grown, increased the size of his works. I've done a live feed artist conversation with him from his studio in Beijing. And it's like, it's almost like an airplane hangar. It's not quite that large, but it's very, very large. And so he's able to make pieces like this example from his series called Upwelling of Gravity that extends to 14 feet high. I was wondering if that would be installed here at the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts. Sadly, it's not. The artist and his gallery wanted it to be installed at the University of Kentucky Art Museum. We looked at the diameter of the entrance and decided that we could not fit the crate into the museum, so unfortunately it was not displayed there either. But he's continuing to push, continuing to explore new ways of expressing himself through ceramic, through sculpture, through stainless steel, and combinations of all of those, increasing his scale. And really, that's what is necessary. That sort of energy, that sort of dedication, that sort of inspiration is really what's necessary to reach a world-class level for a ceramic artist today. And I'm happy to say that although I didn't find an artist who inspired me during the entire year I spent in China in 2006, 2007, that today Li Hongwei certainly qualifies for that. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to address them to the extent of my ability.
Could you follow up on that idea of artists coming to the United States and just a little bit of history that Chinese artists are faced with and the baggage that they have and why they come here and kind of the opportunities that they have here? Is it usually through like graduate schools or of your knowledge?
Okay, so for the people online, the question was, could I go over some of the challenges that are faced by artists, why they come to the United States and how they come here and that sort of thing? Is that correct? Okay. Well, you know, it's interesting. I mean, the United States is not an old country in terms of how long we've been in existence. And it's really been since the post-World War II period that the United States has gained sort of credibility worldwide as a place for art. It was really with the abstract expressionists, Jackson Pollock and others in the 1940s and 50s that, you know, sort of drew the attention of the world. That's not to say there weren't great artists before that, but in terms of really an international influence, that's kind of when it took place. And that's also really when ceramic artists from elsewhere came here. Some of you may be familiar with the Japanese potter, very famous potter, living national treasure, Shoji Hamada Shoji. He visited the United States in the 1950s. And he, in fact, was very influential on studio ceramics in this country because he was a part of the Mingei or folk craft movement. And that had a huge influence on studio potters who make functional ceramics in this country. So, you know, a lot of influence came obviously from Asia to this country. And it's been more recent that ceramic artists and other artists from elsewhere have come here to learn. And there really are not, most of the people who have come to the United States have come from Japan. And that's one of the reasons that Li Hongwei is so notable, is that he came here and his art was transformed by his experience in this country, rather than coming here to show people how Chinese people make ceramics as the teacher, as it were. So he came, when he came, he was a student. He was not an established artist or a master or anything like that. So really the point of my talk is that it is these two cultures coming together that have resulted in his art. If he had stayed in China, I don't think he would have reached this point. If he had been born in America, I don't think he would have reached this point. It's just sort of serendipity that this has come about in a combination of things. And that's also one of the reasons that I believe international education is so important, because you never know what's going to come out of it. Was that helpful? Okay. Someone else?
I didn't quite understand categories that you spoke of earlier, like the rootware, the one, does that refer to a time, or does that refer to a shape?
Okay. Yes. Okay. The question was the categories that I mentioned when I was talking about the Song Dynasty and what those categories or types refer to. In Chinese ceramics as well as Japanese ceramics, there are types that are given names that can refer to a place of production or a style or both. And so there are five great Song Dynasty ceramic types. So there is, now I'm going to forget them all. Junware, the repaired dish that we saw later, that's actually one of the five great ceramic types of the Song Dynasty. It has a blue background with purple, sometimes purple, a mottled color to it. The others are all celadons. So Guanware is a celadon that has a crackle in it and is often sort of bluish in color. Ruware is, I also mentioned, is a type that may have crackle, may not have crackle, may be bluish, but also sometimes greenish. It really depends. But it came from a particular kiln. So it's a particular kiln or particular production area. And the production of Ruware was only for a very short time, probably for a couple of decades. That's why very few pieces survive today. So there's another type that's called Goware that has a very heavy crackle to it. So these are classical types, and they were imitated because they were so highly prized in the Song Dynasty. They've continued to be imitated since then, and there's been a Ruware piece that was sold. I think the last one was sold in 2017 at auction. This is a ceramic. It's not an oil painting. It sold for $34 million at auction. So they're very, very highly prized, but the names refer to the production site and the style of the ware that was made at that production site. All these are from the Song Dynasty. Yeah. And I encourage you to look them up, because online, because they're very beautiful. Mm-hmm. Someone else?
You said that crystalline was volatile.
Mm-hmm.
What does that word volatile refer to?
Is anyone a ceramic artist here? Yeah.
You talked about the whole cooling.
Hold on just a sec. Let me say the question. The question was about volatility in crystalline glazes, which I mentioned, but I didn't really explain how they're volatile. So we're having a ceramic artist.
It would be more because of the technical challenge and the precision with the cooling, because you have to have it at a certain temperature for those crystals to grow. So, you'll always get those errors, and we're half the size of not just doing things. But I think volatile is, it might be a little harsh of a word, but it's just more technical challenge.
Okay, so the explanation was that it's a technical challenge in the cooling and heating process, and the way in which the glaze is formulated or composed, and just kind of a balancing act between those various considerations to get it to come out with beautiful crystals, right? Rather than so-so crystals and consistently, right. So that you don't have misfired pieces. Volatility, I meant in terms of pieces not being usable, right? Assuming that you are making them not just for fun, but to create something beautiful and usable and displayable or whatever, right? Some of them that are not, that have a side that has no crystals, for example, and maybe even part of the glaze has dripped down and left a bare spot. That happens sometimes too. Or in some cases, it can pool together. It can actually pool together at the bottom of a piece and stick it to the floor of the kiln. So it's almost like the glaze slides off and pools at the bottom. And then you can't get the piece off the kiln floor. So it's ruined, right? Even if it, might look okay. So there's a lot of things that can happen that way. Okay, anybody else? All right, well, I thank you so much for coming and for tuning in, those of you who are online. And I wish, please go down and see the exhibition or come and see the exhibition and the other wonderful things here at the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts. Thanks so much.